Thank you, Anthony, for that lovely introduction. Hello, everyone from me. So, Jana.
Hi, everyone, from Federico.
Tonight, we're talking about the question of authority and expertise. And I'd like to get us started by noting that authority seems to be somehow the exact inverse of a thing Descartes once wrote about good sense. So Descartes said that good sense seems to be the best distributed thing in the world, for everyone thinks, well, Descartes said himself, so I think we can paraphrase that and said, everyone thinks themselves so well endowed with it that even those who are most difficult to please in everything else are not at all want to desire more of it than they have. So what Descartes was saying here basically is that everyone seems to think they have just enough of good sense. On the other hand, when it comes to authority, and especially when it comes to the authority of experts, it seems like it is the exact opposite of that. Everyone thinks that there's either too much of it or too little. And especially during, or well, since the start of the COVID pandemic, we've seen quite a few of those reflections, so interpretations of the question of the relationship between knowledge, power, authority, and expertise that claim that experts have either too much or too little power. And I think one of the things, Federico, for me, that connected both of our essays as well as our sort of respective approaches to thinking about knowledge is the fact that we tend not to think so much about whether there is the right amount of expert authority, but rather we are more interested in the question of, wait, what do these questions actually mean? Why is it that we need to discuss expertise and the right amount of authority? What do these questions signify?
Exactly, and I agree with you that there is a tendency to approach the question of expertise and epistemic trust as a question of individual capability, of individual vices and individual virtues, while I think we share a different approach on this question. And while I think that what is known in philosophy as virtue epistemology is a fascinating research program, I believe it could benefit from a sociological update, or at least be supplemented by sociological insight, which means recognizing that attitudes towards experts and epistemic authorities depend on where people are in the social space compared to other people. Some people don't have the same access to knowledge as others. Some people were mistreated or humiliated by experts, and take note of that, of course. So this does not mean to me that judgments cannot be made about how people think about issues of expertise, but it means two things. The first is that one should take into account these differences at the social level and these inequalities into account before making judgments. And the second thing is that the practical implications should not occur primarily at the individual level, at the level of individual behavior, but primarily at the level of deliberate institutional change.
I think that's a great point. And thinking about the ways in which sort of expert authority has been framed, especially, but again, not limited to the coronavirus pandemic, I'm just thinking about that it does tend to kind of, it gets into a very polarized kind of discussion. So on the one hand, we have this idea of, well, you know, there is really too much, but it's not only too much, it's also kind of the wrong kind of expertise that has too much or has exerted too much power. But then on the other hand, there's also too little. And the thing you said about virtue and vice epistemology, I think in this sense often turns on to attempts to assess or estimate or judge other people's epistemic capability. Or rather, for me, more interestingly and more problematically, to infer something about people's epistemic capability from their individual behaviors. Enter the Preknows guide. So for those of you who may have not read the essay that, well, my essay in this particular issue of The Philosopher, which I need to add without any sort of, sort of feigned modesty, I really think is just one among a series of other essays that are way better than mine. So it's really an outstanding issue, and it does seem a bit like awkward when you have to say that about something that you yourself have published in, but I really think all other essays are absolutely worth and more worthy reading. But one of the reasons why I've introduced the Preknows guy is because, so by way of reference, Preknows guys are people who, and they are, I mean, the gendering is obviously a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's also a bit, I guess, statistically founded. They are most often men who wear their masks sort of below their nose or sort of on their chin. So on the one hand, Preknows guys are people who, or in a manner of speaking, they're public figures who very clearly in some ways kind of clash with our opinion of what the proper behavior in relation to a pandemic of an airborne virus should be. So they kind of seem to not really abide by expert opinion, but then on the other hand, they're not openly disputing it either. So reactions to Preknows guys, especially obviously from the side of the people who tend to accept expert opinion, either go in the direction of identifying their behavior with individual epistemic vice. So Preknows guys are either sort of misinformed or have formed the wrong kind of judgment, or just in sort of more brutal terms, stupid or somehow deficient. Or on the other hand, in arguing for kind of social fixes of the information sphere. So if they are misinformed, then maybe we should somehow control the kind of, well, theories or interpretations of the pandemic that those people can actually draw on. And I think what both you and I were trying to say is, well, wait, there is more to how people act, what they know, and how this relates to social conditions than might be sort of supposed or inferred from this kind of logic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Preknows guy is an interesting character, and maybe we'll talk about him more later. But it's true that a sociological approach lets one see that the cleavages that exist in society about question of expertise are profoundly ingrained in society, not only in individual behavior. So I think just even before the pandemic, we were seeing that there was a growing polarization in terms of not only of political attitudes, of course, on various topics such as migration or welfare spending, but also on epistemic attitudes. There were discussions about the role of science in society, whether we should trust experts. There were discussions about literacy tests for voting, IQ-based voting. Parties were saying that a vote for them was a vote for science. So all that was clearly part and parcel of what happened in political debates from 2010 to 2020 at least, and probably even before that. And this was all connected with the rise of populism, the expansion of what were perceived as technocratic forms of government. But I believe Sheila Jasanoff, a legal scholar with an interest in scientific controversies and the use of science in political and legal context, this was mostly a proxy war. Controversies about science in policy context are often proxies for disagreements about values, about competing interests, and about competing ways of life. And I think this is shown by the fact that both those who entertain the narrative that there is a crisis of expertise and those who entertain the narrative that there is an expert capture, in fact, display a great respect for scientific expertise and for science. And this is why I prefer to speak in terms of two different critiques, a critique of what I call public or popular aversion to science, which basically is similar to the notion that there is a crisis of expertise, and the critique of what is seen as an elite perversion of science. And this is supported, for example, by recent surveys that show that, for example, conservatives in the United States have a strong animosity towards scientists and towards academic institutions, because they think they are too on the left, there is groupthink and so on, but not towards science. When you differentiate questions about their feelings towards the group or the institution and their feeling toward the general cultural category, they display a great respect for science. And this testifies to the great cultural power that science still holds. Of course, then there are different views of what science is. For some, science is exemplified by Galileo against the church. For others, it's something different and more complex. But still, there is this idea that you cannot just cast two groups, one that is pro-science and the other that is anti-science. This framing actually is self-fulfilling. It is a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. It alienates those people who, for very reasons, good and bad, tend to have certain ill feelings against scientific experts. And just to close on that, I think what is interesting now is to ask ourselves whether the pandemic has increased or decreased these tensions. And I don't know what is your feeling about this, but my initial reaction when the pandemic exploded was that these cleavages that are scientific, but mostly based on values and competing interests, were increased, heightened by the pandemic in the beginning. But then later on, and after more than a year that we are into this, I feel that actually there might be compromises that are forming. Because you see, even politicians and parties and movements who are radically hostile to what they saw as an elite perversion of science, had to come to terms with the fact that there was a pandemic. They could not deny it altogether. They could say that people were overreacting, but after a while, after an initial hit, they had to admit that there was something like that. And to me, this is what is exemplified by the Italian case that I'm observing closely, where the partisan movement that were more radically opposed to expert capture started to become more pragmatic. And the coalition government that was formed a few months ago, to me, is a good exemplification of this.
I think that's a really interesting set of points. I think it speaks to something that, we could also dub politics of reality, but also kind of the politics of the use of scientific advice. And one of the things I've sort of introduced or referred to in the essay is sort of Linda Zagrzebski's work on the relationship between knowledge, expertise, and authority, which precisely identifies this tension between trust in authority or trust in including trust in expert authority, which, again, in many cases, to at least, I guess, most people, or in most cases, is unproblematic, right? We don't go to a dentist and then sit in the dentist chair and query the dentist about the procedure that they're applying or whether it's really the right amount of anesthetic. We don't really query the train driver about whether she has enough knowledge to actually run or drive or, direct the train, and so on and so forth. So in a lot of contexts, we actually rely on authority unproblematically. So when authority becomes contested, and especially, as you've said, when it becomes contested in specific ways, and this is why, to me, the sort of the Goldilocks question, what is the right amount of scientific authority or trust in scientific expertise is so revealing, then we usually reveal other cleavages in society. And, as you've said, the way that those cleavages are portrayed is often not what these discussions really are about. So, and in that sense, to me, one of the things that have stood out from the very start of the pandemic is precisely the question that I think we both addressed, I mean, both in these respective essays, in the philosopher issue, but also in our respective work prior to this, which is, you know, what does it mean to say that there are politics of expertise? What does it mean to say that expertise is political? In what ways is expertise actually political? And what do we mean when we say that, for instance, experts are becoming politicized? Because one of the things that were for me super interesting to observe during the course of the pandemic is the change from using science or using scientific advice, and specifically in the UK, which was the kind of case where I was focusing most of my empirical work on, and where I'm also based, to observe the change between government and, well, politicians and policymakers claiming that they were guided by science, and something that was an obvious, in a manner of speaking, cherry picking of scientific advice as well as evidence on which to build policies on, but then shift towards a more determined decisionist view of politics, where some of the figureheads of the government were actually saying, well, no, it is the role of scientific advisor to advise, but we actually take or hold responsibility for the decisions we make. So in some ways, there's a really interesting mix between the kind of political power that we say associate with the government more closely, and the kind of expert power, or the kind of power that we could sort of argue works in part through politics of reality. So I'm wondering if we could kind of talk a bit about, you know, in what ways is expertise political to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see at least two main meanings to the idea that expertise is political. The first is that the content of expert advice is political. And that's because expertise generally contains policy, or at any rate, practical recommendations. Expertise is different from pure science. Of course, it is debatable whether pure science also contains normative elements, is value-laden, and most philosophers would agree with that claim. But it's certain that expertise, by producing these recommendations that are requested by decision makers and by policymakers in particular, contains these practical recommendations. And these recommendations can influence decisions, and these decisions, of course, can affect people differently according to various factors, according, once again, to their position, their interest and their position in the social space. Presumably, some people will lose and others will gain. That everybody gains in the same way is quite unlikely. And even if there is a Pareto improvement, what economists call the Pareto improvement, meaning that some agents gain and no agents will lose, this will still be perceived by some as unjust, right? The second reason why expertise is political is how you organize the expert process, how expert advice is organized. And this can be done in extremely different ways. And a good thing of the pandemic is that it has shown how differently across countries and across regions it can be organized. And this can affect the way it is organized, can affect the practical recommendations that are selected by the experts. And this is not limited only to which experts are appointed, but also what is the size of expert groups, what is their internal heterogeneity, what kind of disciplines are selected, what is the interactions with policymakers or with their aides, as famously happened in the UK, what are the financial and symbolic incentives that scientists and experts have, what forms of accountability, what procedural agreements are needed to reach a decision. All that can change tremendously the final result in terms of practical recommendations. Now, of course, one might think that emphasizing the political nature of expertise provides ammunition to ill-intentioned groups, to groups that benefit from dismissing the capability of science to reach a good result, that can basically be used by merchants of doubts, to mention a famous concept in history of science. And these, of course, can lead to undue attacks to scientific expertise. But I think we'll have time to discuss about the harmful consequences that are attributed to theories later. I don't know what you have to think about this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, this I think points out exactly to the unwieldiness of the question of, the golden ratio of trust in scientific experts, because on the one hand, we obviously all want the public at large, we want the so-called ordinary people or lay people, which is the other kind of category that I particularly like problematizing and would like to go back to. We'd want them to be able to question scientific expertise as such, right? And this is what we normally think of as this kind of corollary of not only epistemic, but also personal autonomy. So in principle, if we are committed to epistemic self-reliance and epistemic egalitarianism, so if we're committed to the idea that it's on the whole better if people form opinions by themselves, and if we're committed to the idea that in principle all people have equal epistemic capacities, then we kind of want people to be able to challenge scientific consensus, right? We want people to be able to, read some of the expert advice, perhaps what's published in the media, and form their own opinions. This seems like a normal and a desirable feature of a democracy. On the other hand, obviously, we don't want people to be able to question just about anything. So to kind of go back to the previous examples, right? It would be a bit disruptive if each single time we tried boarding a train, 5 people got off, stopped the train in its tracks and went like, wait, what are your actual, what are your precepts? On what basis are you finding this? How are you running the train? What's your knowledge of physics? Are you absolutely certain this is going to run the way that you expect it to run? And so on and so forth. And this is one of the things that I think we as sort of theorists and as people who work on knowledge encounter every single time when we try discussing the politics of expertise, because often any kind of discussion about different ways in which expertise is political exactly gets used as a reason to not only stoke doubt, but also to say, oh, well, there you see, or rather, there you go, there you can see that actually even experts are driven by, sort of personal or economic and political, what's even worse, interests. And to me, this has always been really a really interesting case of one of the kind of the main points of my work, which is the origins of the mix-up between the epistemic and the moral meaning of right, or wrong for that matter. So why is it that we assume that if someone is epistemically wrong, or if we claim that someone is epistemically wrong, if we judge someone as being epistemically in the wrong, so say the Preknows guys, people who refuse to wear their masks properly, why and how is it that we also bring in some sort of moral evaluation, such as that, for instance, they are, if not sort of explicitly vicious, then at least not as socially responsible or not as caring towards other people or towards as caring of the public good as perhaps we want people to be?
That's a great question. And I guess taking the example of the Preknows guys can be a good start to an answer to this question. Of course, one could see them as this character as hopelessly misinformed or too stupid to understand basic information, right? You could say health authorities say that you should cover your nose. it is hard to imagine that they have misinterpreted these guidance, right? If they have, then it means that we have serious problems with what you call the principle of epistemic self-reliance and the egalitarian principle, right? This clearly that there's a problem there. So maybe there's another interpretation that at least we can think of that is compatible with these principles. Perhaps the Preknows guy knows the science, is able to understand the guidance from health authorities to cover his nose, but also knows that covering your nose does not grant you much protection. He might say that mask wearing, after all, is crucial at the collective level because that will stop the virus from spreading on large numbers, but at the individual level, it doesn't matter very much. So the risk for him is quite low, and the hassle of covering his face outweighs the risk for others. And also the fact of normalizing a behavior that is clearly harmful at the collective level. So in this second interpretation, the Preknows guy is basically just selfish, right? He's a free rider to some extent. A different interpretation that includes even more a higher degree of what philosophers call non-cognitive values is that perhaps the Preknows guy knows the science, understands the guidance from health authorities, and he knows that he and others might suffer from the fact that he doesn't use the mask properly. But at the same time, he still wants to assert his personal or political autonomy anyway by lowering the mask. And I see two slightly different versions of this interpretation. One is just a general stubbornness when others dictate how he should behave, especially if these others are more powerful, more distant than him, like these experts in these institutions. Or perhaps it is not this stubbornness, but rather the fact that they want to assert their autonomy by choosing at least whom to trust, which expert to trust, right? And this ends up leading the Preknows guy to support bogus theories that they may not really believe themselves, but it's just some kind of emotional need to choose whom to trust.
Yeah, that's one of the, it's one of the things that I've also kind of suggested in this essay is precisely that we could see this kind of behavior not as a reflection of epistemic virtue or vice, and certainly not, or actually not as a reflection of the kind of information available or the state or, the public sphere or, fake news, whatever. But also the feature of the fact that people's choices in many cases today are actually very constrained. So many people do not really have a choice of whether they're going to work and what kind of work they're going to engage in, and whether they will be expected by their boss to work unsociable hours. Many people have decreasingly a choice where they're going to live, because housing is housing is one of the major sources of or reflections of social inequality, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, this gesture of lowering one's mask could also be an assertion of personal autonomy. And I think it's really important for us when we talk about sort of how people behave in relation to expert advice and that sort of thing, to reflect precisely on this thing that it's not always a direct correlation between people kind of knowing the science and then behaving in a certain way. And I'm a huge fan of exploring exactly these contradictions, starting from the most obvious one, to me at least, which is that we all know about the harm of carbon emissions, and yet most of us continue to fly regardless, or at least have not stopped flying entirely, and so on and so forth. But I think this really just brings us back to the question of, the difficulty of, first of all, remaining committed to both epistemic self-reliance and epistemic equality. So the idea that, people should be free to choose what or how they form their beliefs, and they have equal capacity, at least in principle, to do that, because we kind of invariably, I think, thread on either or, well, both in some cases. But also what we're actually saying when we say that this means that somehow there is a relationship between politics and expert advice, and how we actually form opinions about or how we relate to other people based on what kind of expert advice they choose to follow. And the interesting thing for me here is that following on from that initial quote from Descartes, the interesting thing about Descartes is that he actually said that the power of judging well and distinguishing true from false, which is what he associated common sense or reason with, is naturally equal in all men, and basically argued that people form different opinions because they take different routes to conclusions, rather than because they are somehow, some of them are somehow deficient in terms of reasoning. So I see that questions are beginning to come in, but I would like us to have some time to address what I think is, the kind of thing that we also connected over relatively early on in our acquaintance, and that's why is it that we need to discuss what is the content of these theories or of expert advice and so on and so forth? Why is it that everyone is so obsessed with what the experts are saying and whether experts are actually as virtuous or perhaps less or more virtuous than the so-called ordinary people?
We definitely consider scientific theories to be very powerful. We consider that the theories that are disseminated by scientists, both in the natural and the social sciences, and even the medical scientists, can have a tremendous impact on reality. That's clear, and we have seen over the last year the cultural authority that scientists had. And what I find very interesting here is the fact that all sorts of consequences, positive and negative, are attributed to science, and often with very limited evidence. For example, following on the kind of examples that I discussed also in the essay, the link between classical economics and the financial crisis of 2008. There's definitely something there, but sometimes we just satisfy ourselves with the very broad and wide sweeping statements. So I think there are two ways of looking at this. One can study these attributions from outside without making them, these attributions of power, of social and political power to scientific theories. We can understand how they influence evaluations and assessments of the theories themselves. Now, many journals, for example, ask reviewers to say whether the work they are reviewing could cause harm. For example, they have to tick a box if that's the case. So one can study how these evaluations, these attributions, change with the changes in cultural sensibilities and moral attitudes. One can study how these attributions are sometimes part of a settling of scores among what could be seen as rival gangs of scientists and social scientists in particular. Or, and this is the other way of looking at this, one can study how and whether theories actually have effects, have practical effects, and under which conditions they have this power that is so often attributed to them. So in this way, one would end up making his or her own attributions of social power, hopefully with better arguments and evidence that is generally found. And I think in this case, one should just be sure to be very sensitive to difference in context and use the best methods they can use. But I think this is really one of the most promising areas in social theory and the sociology of knowledge.
Yeah, I was just going to say, or perhaps plug, both Federico and I have articles in a special issue of the European Journal of Social Theory that's coming out very soon as the whole of special issue, which both of which it's been edited by Federico and address precisely these questions. And my angle has always been to kind of say, well, okay, why is it that we need to believe theories have power to begin with? Because nowadays we do encounter quite a lot of these statements. I mean, what you've mentioned about the power of neoclassical economics to have generated the economic crisis is one of those. Obviously, say, current critiques by both the UK and the French government of the critical race theory are another example. I mean, in your essay, you engage with a lot of these supposedly controversial academics who do not only think the critical race theory has that sort of power, but also tend to think that almost all kinds of post-structuralist theories have this sort of power. So to me, the main question remains, even if we accept that under certain conditions, some theories clearly have performative powers, is precisely what these conditions are. And I think what we both agree on is that these conditions are not a question of individual epistemic capacity, or on the other hand, you know, sort of the evil plotting politicians as opposed to good and naive scientists, but rather these are social conditions, and these are social conditions that actually explicitly address how different social groups that do have different interests relate to one another or compete with one another. And this clearly includes groups of scientists and experts. And it happens in a very, very stratified, unequal, and dynamic social landscape. On that note, I think we've had quite a few interesting questions come in. Would you like to start taking questions? My guess is, shall we go in the order of well, submission appearance? So Mark Carrigan is asking, how do you interpret fringe lay communities which have an avowed commitment to empiricism, for example, the flat earth movement, which is built around the belief in seeing things with your own eyes? It's a pre-modern and chaotic empiricism, but it's a sincere and in its own absurd way, systematic commitment to experimental knowledge. Do you want to take this one?
Yes, there's definitely, this is something that I address in the essay as well, when I in another essay, not the philosopher essay, but another essay that I wrote about these two competing narratives. These two competing critiques, the elite perversion and the public aversions to science, and those who think that there is an elite perversion of science often have a very stylized conception of what science is. And this reminds me of what you're mentioning about this extreme empiricism. Science is just equated with the questioning, the challenges, the questioning and the criticism of established truth. It is equated with doubting, with being overly skeptical, with that kind of cognitive process, not with the fact of being content with a certain amount of established knowledge. So they, and of course the flat earth theorists are an extreme version of that, but you find similar arguments, maybe of course with different degrees of radicality in a wide variety of different movements, which is also quite well represented along the whole political spectrum, in which there are certain numbers of common argumentative tropes, such as, once again, the reference to Galileo as a very important figure of that kind of science. Of course, the real history is very often completely distorted, right? The real history of Galileo. But yes, yet there is this kind of strong empiricism. And the contrast, the bad science that is contrasted to this truthful science, is a science made of consensus, is made of powerful institutions, rich institutions, of technicians who just repeat what they always do without questioning what they're doing, of course, of interests with powerful groups, and so on and so forth. So I think that's an extreme case, but what I find interesting is how actually you find similar arguments across the spectrum.
And that's a really good point, and actually connects to next question, which came from Phil Chandler, who's asking whether there is a significant difference between types of expertise, such as the practical or professional training of the trained driver, dentist, nurse, etc., versus the academic expertise. And I guess which is more oriented towards making predictions on uncertain or contested data. And I would say, I mean, I was thinking about both Federico and I can see the Q&A, but I'm just reading them out for sort of clarity purpose. I think actually, Federico, what you've just said in some ways addresses that very question. And to me, what's really interesting about it, especially from the perspective of someone who works on predictions and their fallibility, as it were, is precisely the idea that we tend to see the first type of expertise, so dentists, nurses, drivers, etc., as technical and not political. And this distinction between technique or techne and politics, as well as between techne and episteme, actually is, I think, historically very interesting. So why do we see technical expertise as less problematic, which I think connects to seeing it as less politically productive? And I'd like to, so in this particular case, a fellow and sort of, to me, sort of collaborator, social theorist Lindsay McGooey, has this concept of oracular power, which is precisely this idea that some people have the capacity, by the use of their virtue, well, the virtue of their expertise or expert credentials, to make predictions. So in that sense, and it's not only people who make predictions, because actually trained drivers as well as dentists need to make predictions in order to be able to do their work. So for instance, they need to be able to say, oh, I think, you know, this will heal in about 2.5 days. Or I think that if this doesn't happen, then you are probably fine. But if something else happens, maybe we need to put you on the course of antibiotics. But we rarely actually dispute those kinds of decisions. So why do we see one kind of expertise as based on more uncertain terrain and the other as based on more certain terrain? To me, comes back to the question of, you know, why is it that we believe theories and actually specific kinds of theories have power at all?
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. I was thinking that maybe certain areas are simply less controversial than others, in the sense that the implications, and once again, the power of ideas are seen as less important, as less significant for the global worldview and the values of a person. So for even for flat Earth, for people who believe in flat Earth, this idea that maybe what they've been taught all their life is completely false at this very extremely important level, then of course resonates with the idea that their life is important, and what they think about these, the way they think about these issues is actually extremely important to think about the value of their life in a way that probably a more technical and less controversial type of expertise would not be able to provide that kind of support to a certain worldview and the existential satisfaction from holding a certain belief.
I think that's that's definitely a good point, and I'm wondering if it actually connects also directly. So thank you to everyone who submitted questions. They've just appeared more and more are appearing by the minute, so we probably won't be able to address all of them, sadly, but they're kind of really feeding well into the discussion, I think. So David Moore is asking whether one source of conflict between scientific authority and political authority might be the incongruity of their respective timeframes, because it takes considerable time to achieve scientific consensus, but political decisions have to be made like now. In, say, March 2020, scientists didn't know whether, for instance, you'd need to disinfect your groceries, but states had to choose whether and how much to shut down. I think this is something that speaks to both of our sort of respective concerns, and I think it's definitely true. And I mean, it also corresponds to the kind of empirical work I've done, as well as the policy work I've done as a policy advisor. And I think what it also connects to, also in relation to the preceding question, is also the timeframes of responsibility. So it's not only the time frame of making or arriving to relatively reliable conclusions, because obviously science has a broader time frame or longer time frame in that sense, but it's also the time frame of, well, okay, when can you be held accountable for being wrong? And when it comes to politics, there is usually a very well-defined time frame, normally limited by the electoral cycle. So, and I think this is one of the, we've seen a very direct effect of that in the United States. And, you know, we may hope that we'll see it in the UK eventually as well, though maybe not as trends seem to be going. But I think it does in some ways highlight the fact that sometimes politicians act within the time frame, not necessarily of now, but of now and in the next elections, and scientists are less limited by that. I don't know if you want to sort of...
No, I agree, absolutely agree with that. And also, of course, this is why it is so important for experts not to overreach and not to exaggerate the knowledge they possess, and to be clear about the limits of their knowledge. And it is true that at the beginning of the pandemic, for various reasons, this was not always the case. There was an exaggeration of the knowledge we had, in particular with respect to masks, right? That were deemed by many expert bodies not very useful or not useful at all. So there was that reminds us how important it is for experts to be clear about that. But also, I don't think it is a matter, once again, of individual virtues and vices. Virtues and vices is more that there is an institutional structure that will provide experts with incentives to act more or less in accord with that kind of attitude that does not overreach the knowledge they possess.
I'm wondering if I'm going to skip to Ellie Travis's question and ask, because we already had one from Mark Carrigan. So could you talk about the connection between uncertainty and decision making in the context of expertise? It seems to me, perhaps following Jasonov, which I think is probably why you, Federico, should take the question, because you were mentioning Sheila Jasonov, that during the pandemic, scientists were forced to make recommendations based on their expertise and not science. Does this erode trust when scientists are forced to wade into public debates?
Sorry, could you, so this is the question by?
Ellie Travis is the first one in the sequence. I can repeat it. So could you could you talk about the connection between uncertainty and decision-making in the context of expertise? It seems to me, perhaps following Jasonov, that during the pandemic, scientists were forced to make recommendations based on their expertise, connoted by their professional networks and credentials, and not science. Does this erode trust when scientists are forced to wade into public debates? I think this connects a bit, sorry, go ahead.
Go on. I
was going to say, I think this actually connects a bit to the preceding question, which is, you know, when does or different timeframes under which science becomes political, and how do we actually judge science or scientists versus politicians or politics in relation to that? But would you like to sort of
No, just that I think it is inevitable for scientists to be involved in policy decision and decision making. I don't think we should have left them alone, right, doing their projects and looking for the good answers. I think it was a good decision to bring them in from the start, but at the same time, you also had to do other things. That is something that Jazanov and in the piece in Science suggested, that you should also bring in people from civil society to talk with scientists and to be sure that the scientists do not feel pressured into providing immediately useful answers. But definitely they should have acted. I think it was a good decision to involve experts from the start.
I think that's a serious statement. Paul is asking, when will the special issue of the European Journal of Social Theory be available? I think we can type the answer to that one. Some articles are available already, but the entirety of the issue should be available soon, but we can send more detail. I think we have about time for another 2 questions, maybe. I'm not seeing any sort of harsh looks or chats from Anthony. We have 2 minutes left, so maybe 2 questions. Tarun is asking, is there some confusion between 2 representations of expert knowledge? One is that expert knowledge is infallible, and to question expert findings is to be against objective knowledge. And the other is that expert knowledge is incremental and based on uncertainty, so expert claims could be reversed, and expressing anger when such reversal happens is basically having, or a reflection of having, an unrealistic expectations of expertise. I mean, I'd be inclined to agree, and the 2 representations are, I think, in conflict precisely because we place different expectations on the reliability of or consistency of expert advice. I think because we confuse, and I'm not saying, again, confusion is not an epistemic feature, especially not an individual epistemic feature, because there is a narrative that mixes up the moral and the epistemological. So we expect in some ways experts to be infallible because we associate infallibility with authority in general. So I think we tend to think that if experts have authority, then that authority should somehow be connected with infallibility. And that's obviously not the case, just like it's not the case for anyone else, not only experts. I don't know, do you want to?
No, I agree with that, absolutely. I think another maybe a related issue that might be important to mention is the fact that often there is the sense that is often also defended by scientists themselves, unfortunately, that facts speak for themselves, right? And that the lesson that we should draw from facts, and especially the policy implication that we should draw from facts, are obvious. And this is definitely one of the most important factors that can produce a backlash against science, because of course it's not like that. I mean, you always have to include the values and interests of people who are not part of the experts in that equation. You cannot just draw policy implications from facts.